Loading up, getting centered. Okay, looks like it's all broadcasting the way it's supposed to. It's nice when technology works. I think that should be the catchphrase for many of my video classes. Okay, it is 12:01. Just have another sip of tea and then we'll get down to work. I have to adjust Rashi over here. He's out of sync. All right, well, hopefully, let's just double check the YouTube feed is up and running. Yes, it is. Hopefully everyone has logged in. If not, you can always hit rewind if you're watching this through YouTube and catch up with whatever you missed. So without further time, let's go ahead and dive in. We are in Behaalotecha, chapter 8, the book of Bamidbar, the book of Numbers, and we are carrying on with some of the preparations, and we are going to again encounter a topic which may seem slightly out of place, just as we talked about with some of the instructions last week, but it is in place for other reasons, and that will be discussed as we go through. So let's go ahead and dive into the Torah itself and talk about something that is probably very familiar, at least conceptually, to many of us, which is the menorah. The menorah was the seven-branched candelabrum. Lamp is probably the better word. Candelabrum implies candles in the modern world. But of course, candles were not used until fairly recently in human history terms. Prior to that, it was, of course, oil. And the menorah that was in the Mishkan and then later in the Temple of Jerusalem was an essential element of the items, the vessels of both the Mishkan and the temple. And we're going to see a particular aspect. Now, again, you might be wondering, why are we talking about the menorah now rather than talking about the menorah when we first encountered the menorah way back in the book of Shemot, of Exodus, when we saw its initial construction? Or failing that, maybe in the book of Vayikra and Leviticus, when we saw the inauguration of the Mishkan. Why are we hearing now in the book of Numbers some of these instructions? Keep that question in mind as we go through. Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to Aaron and say to him, when you mount the lamps, let the 7 lamps give light at the front of the lampstand." Okay, now you'll notice that in the JPS translation here, we have this lovely little asterisk, which is together with that word mount, whereas if you click on it, it says, go back and double check Exodus 25:37. But what we are confused by here is the actual name of the parasha, Behaalotecha. What exactly is this Behaalotecha referring to? That is something that we're going to have to come back to our commentators for. Here it is taking the notion of going up in some installation kind of way. That's where the JPS translation is choosing to define it. But as we're going to see, there are some other alternatives. This should not be, too off-putting. Hopefully, you have been with me enough, or at the very least, studied your own native language as well as a little bit of Hebrew, to recognize that languages will always have words that have multiple valences, multiple meanings that can be understood in different contexts. And sometimes those meanings are very clear, and sometimes those meanings are not very clear. In English, if we were to say, I am going to shoot the bird, and someone else says, I am going to shoot the bird, those can be two entirely different conversations. One could be, the first person could be a hunter, and the second person could be a photographer. But without that additional context, we might be confused. Sometimes it does happen that in the Hebrew, there are just enough options of what a word might mean that we need our commentary to weigh in. Most of the time, yes, it is very clear, even for words that have multiple meanings, what it means in this context. but occasionally it can be a little bit less definitive and requires a bit more discussion. So here we are lighting the 7 lamps. Now, that doesn't mean that there are actually 7 menorahs. As you can see, it is a ha-menorah that has 7 nerot. Nerot, many people nowadays think of as being candles. Lamp is not a bad, but really the light or the light giving thing is the better, more literal kind of concept. So that's what's actually being lit at this time. The individual buckets of oil that are going to be lit at each end of the arms of the menorah. Onward with verse 3. Aaron did so. He mounted the lamps at the front of the lampstand as Adonai had commanded Moses. We'll definitely be talking about this front issue of what do you mean front of a lampstand? Does it have a front, a side, a back? We'll be coming back to that. Now, this is how the lampstand was made. It was hammered work of gold, hammered from base to pedal. According to the pattern that Adonai had shown Moses, so was the lampstand made. So, yes, we did discuss this back in the book of Exodus, and now we are getting a reiteration of this. A reminder that when it talks about pedal here, it does actually mean pedals, at least metalworked pedals. The menorah had a botanical motif to it. It was shaped like the bottoms of buds of flowers, and so indeed it would have had a very organic kind of construction artistic style. Adonai spoke to Moses saying, actually, you know what? Before we get on to the Levites, let's go ahead and pause here and look at the commentary up to this point before we move on to the next topic. Okay, so back up to verse number 2. We're going to start off with Rashi, as we often do, to try and give us a basic idea of why this discussion is happening here. So, why is this section treating the candelabrum, the menorah, put in juxtaposition, put next to the section dealing with the offerings of the princes? What are we talking about? Well, if we roll it back, we can see the list of all of the offerings that were brought, and by all of the princes, meaning the heads of the different tribes, the important people. And of course, we see that each one comes from a different chieftain of the different tribes. And then we get all of our total, and then we make the sudden shift from all of those offerings that were brought, those donations is probably the better way of putting it, since offering is usually in English referring to sacrifices, whereas these were different gifts that would be useful for the functioning of the Mishkan, rather than an individual personal sacrifice like a sin offering or such. So why is this section here next to that? Well, because when Aaron saw the dedication offerings of the princes, he felt distressed because neither he nor his tribe was with them in the dedication. So why would they have not been involved in the dedication? After all, we had 12 tribes donating. Well, yes, we had 12, but that was because as the Levites stepped out from that normal tribal list, Ephraim and Manasseh, the 2 children of Joseph, stepped in, and Joseph himself was also not included as his children now had his slot. So we still have 12 tribes participating, but not the 12 original sons of Jacob. One of them, the Levites, had been removed from this list, and that is because they are the ones doing the officiating and work, remembering that the Kohanim, the children of Aaron, are part of the Levites as well. So there is a feeling of being left out, that the Levites were not participating in this opportunity to make these donations. And so when Aaron sees this, the Midrash imagines him feeling upset, left out, and then God, the Holy One, blessed be He, said to him, by your life, a typical format in Hebrew for like making an oath or a promise, your part is of greater importance than theirs, for you will kindle and set in order the lamps. So the notion here is that the Levites were concerned that they were being left out of this whole process, and God reminded them that, yes, these others may be making the donations, but you are the one who will be using those donations in order to actually kindle the lamp, and which is a greater place to be in possession of the material wealth to make these donations, or to be the one who is actually executing, carrying out these instructions with your own hands. Obviously, the implication here is that it should be the one who is carrying it out that feels especially blessed. Now we're going to jump over to Chizkuni, who's going to be our second partner for today. And Chizkuni has a slightly expanded version on this topic. The commandment about lighting the lamps on the menorah appears immediately following the consecration rites of the altar, because we have heard about 12 tribal leaders, each offering a sacrifice on that occasion, while the tribe of Levi, its representative Aaron, has not been allocated any role in that important event. The Levites had started to grumble about having been excluded from these festivities. They wanted to know the reason why they had been excluded. As a result, God immediately told Aaron and his sons that what the representatives of the other tribes had done was only in the nature of something preparatory, whereas it had been reserved for them to do the actual consecration of the temple/altar. The reader is referred by our author to Nachmanides, who has a much longer commentary on this, as Ramban often does. But then the final line, Aaron is initially to involve his sons in these activities, and subsequently also other members of the tribe of Levi, which will explain why the second part of this chapter, which I paused just before we began, is going to deal with the Levites, is going to deal with the broader role of the Levites in the whole structure here. So hold on for that, but it then gives us a 1, 2, 3 type of ordering of why these passages come here in this place. That, yes, this instruction could have been given back at the original construction of the Mishkan, but by placing it here after the listing of the 12 tribes' participation in the donations for the initial inauguration, it reminds us of the special role that Aaron and the Levites have within the actual execution of these commandments. Okay, let's go back to Rashi to finish off our discussion of verse 2. Going now to this whole Behaalotecha, and here you can see this translator of Rashi is translating Behaalotecha not as when you mount, but instead as when you make the lights rise, still going from this idea of Allah, of rising up, the same word that we use for aliyah, for coming up to the bima, or immigrating to Israel. But rather than it being Aaron that is rising, it is the flames that are rising. Why then is that being said in this way? Rashi, because the flame rises upwards, an expression denoting ascending is used of kindling them, meaning the lights, implying that one must kindle them until the light ascends of itself. So, by using this phrase, Behaalotecha, says Rashi from the Talmud, it is reminding us of a very practical matter, that lighting a flame does not mean just tossing a match at the wick. It means actually making sure that the wick has caught, that the oil is flowing up through it, and that the flame is now working on its own. I know many of us are spoiled in the modern world, where we only light candles that are beautifully manufactured in factories, and special wicks that have been properly treated to always take quite easily from the slightest touch of a match flame. But that wasn't always the case. For much of our history, getting the wick to catch, getting the capillary action to make the oil be drawn up into the wick, so that it can burn and continue to renew itself from the reservoir, that took a little extra effort and focus and time. And Rashi here is reminding us that that is what it means when you light something in Judaism. It may not be a practical concern for us in the modern world because our candles are much easier to kindle, but it is still a very important psychological term, that we don't engage with a commandment superficially or half-heartedly, but we engage with it to the point where it actually becomes lit, becomes, most importantly, self-perpetuating. So that is what it means to actually do the action. It's not enough to do it very superficially. Rashi continues, over against the candlestick. So this is this idea here, where they tried to translate this as at the front of the lampstand. One of the things about the JPS translation is they often will rework the word order to make it more natural in English, but sometimes you'll lose a little bit of the sense from the original Hebrew. What Rashi is drawing our attention to is that this in front of the lampstand means over against the central lamp, which is not on one of the branches like the others, but on the body of the central shaft of the candelabrum itself. So in order to understand how this could be lit against itself or facing itself, what Rashi is trying to tell us is that it was giving light towards the central shaft. With the 7-branched candelabrum, you'll have the main shaft in the middle and then 3 branches coming off on each side. And the idea here is that the 3 branches on the side are giving light towards that center piece. Now, our JPS translation just gives it to the front of the lampstand, but both of these commentaries now, and most translations are indeed commentaries, are hopefully at least reminding us that when we are lighting something that isn't just a cylindrical candle with a wick in the center, that you had to position the wick in the bowl on the lip of the cup to decide which angle the flame would be coming out from. Indeed, that's how Rashi continues. The 7 lamps, meaning the central lamp itself, which naturally gave light over against the shaft. Obviously, it's right over its shaft. Its light is going to illuminate it no matter where it is. And the 6 lamps, which were on the 6 branches. That is to say, the 3 on the east side of the central shaft should have their wicks turned toward the central one. And similarly, the 3 on the west should have their ends of their wicks turned towards the central one. And why is this? In order that people should not say, he, God, is in need of its, meaning the candlesticks, the menorah's light. All right, let's get the visualization first before we get to the meaning. So the visualization is that, for example, the 3 candlesticks on the right-hand side would have their wicks pointing towards the center. And the 3 candles on the left-hand side would have their wicks pointing towards the center. So they were all sort of focusing their light towards that center shaft. As I mentioned, when you're lighting a candle, lighting a wick in an oil reservoir in this type of lamp, you have some choices of where you put the wick. And here the idea is that the wick should be angled rotated, if it will, towards that centerpiece. So from the right to the center, from the left to the center. Now, the explanation that Rashi is giving here, taken from the Midrash, is that this is in order to avoid the mistaken notion that the menorah was lit in order to give off more light, that somehow God wanted more light, that this is a very inefficient arrangement of the wicks. Normally, if you were going to have a 7-branched oil lamp, you would want the wicks pointing in as many directions as possible, because that way it would give off as much light as possible, rather than making one very bright spot near the center of the lamp, but not much beyond that. But of course, the lamp is not designed as a lighting device. If you need a lighting device, you have a lighting device. That's what a regular lamp is. This capital menorah, this capital lampstand, is not designed as a simple lighting tool. This is designed as a representation of God's presence and of our connection to God. And that has nothing to do with how well you arrange the wicks to illuminate the room. So as such, Rashi is letting us know there is more going on here than just turning on the light switch. Now, Chizkuni has more to say about this Behaalotecha as well, this lighting, rising up, mounting concept. So when you light the lamps, this command was issued on the day the tabernacle had been erected and stayed up, meaning when it was first properly constructed and inaugurated, because they started to light the lamps in order to teach that these lamps burned throughout the night also. The light in the tabernacle was like an eternal flame. So it's pointing out that even before the official inauguration, and certainly before this particular point in the Torah narrative, that the menorah would have been lit very early on. And that was because the menorah was supposed to be burning constantly, even when the tabernacle was not in use, meaning even when it was not being used for a particular ceremony, sacrifice, or other ritual, the menorah was supposed to be always on. Indeed, like an eternal flame, quoting here from Ibn Ezra. And indeed, in every modern synagogue, you will find a ner tamid, an eternal flame or light that is reminiscent, a reminder of that idea. We find something similar in connection with the prophet Samuel. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was sleeping in the temple when he called out to Samuel. So from the promotion of Samuel to prophet, there's this idea of, again, a ner, a light that is in the Mishkan that is still burning when Samuel hears the call. Excuse me. When you kindle the lamps towards the front of the menorah, as we were talking about from Rashi, the priest or high priest performing this procedure was to take up position facing the 7 lamps on the menorah. As a result, the lights would all illuminate. The words that this is about facing the menorah do not refer to the words that followed, that the 7 lights were to illuminate it, as understood by Rashi. So just to make sure you understand, Chizkuni is disagreeing with Rashi's idea that this was specifically about making them illuminate that center shaft. But as is clear from what Aaron actually did, as reported in the verse following, he had lit the lamps while facing them, which we see here in verse 3, that is just a physical description of Aaron standing in front of them. That this is just saying he didn't light it from behind, he didn't light it from the side, he lit it while facing directly. A different interpretation, as is often the case for our commentary. The words Behaalotecha, the lighting, lifting, mounting question, are to be understood literally, meaning when you raise their lamps, when you will then place the wicks in their position. That is to say, they are not considered as fixtures in their respective positions, seeing that as we have read in Exodus 37:17, and he constructed the menorah, candlestick's a really terrible translation, and subsequently we read also in Exodus 37, and he made the lamps thereof 7 and their tongues. So they had to be somewhat separate components. He turned the 7 mouths for the wicks toward the center shaft of the front of the candlestick, while facing the dividing curtain in the sanctuary, which was hung between the sanctuary and the innermost holies housing the ark, the Holy of Holies, as we call it, more commonly in the English. So he's saying that this was about arranging, indeed, but here we get the introduction of a slightly different concept, which was that there is a debate about whether or not the menorah was situated perpendicular to the length of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle, or whether the menorah was positioned parallel to the length of the Mishkan. That is to say, was it running from north to south, or was it running from east to west? And Chizkuni will give us some more on that idea. So here he's first mentioned the idea of it running north-south and facing towards the sanctuary. As he points out, this would make sense according to the sage, meaning according to those who had that position, who claims that the position of the menorah was in the north-south direction. Its broadside was facing the dividing curtain in one direction, whereas the opposite broadside faced the entrance of the sanctuary. So it sort of went across the short distance of the Mishkan. According to the sage who claimed that the menorah was positioned in an east-west direction, their debate partners, it would have faced the table in the sanctuary. This is how we can interpret what is written in Exodus 4. He placed the menorah opposite the table. So there are good reasons to think that the menorah might have been running north-south, its light then shining, towards the Holy of Holies. On the other hand, it may have been shining towards the table that was kept there, and matching the at least potential interpretation of Exodus 4. And then finally, the 7 lamps shall provide illumination. This would refer to the 6 lamps, 3 on each side of the central shaft of the menorah. According to our author, this would be the correct text in Rashi. But the scribes of Rashi's manuscripts have omitted a word by mistake. The word hamsa'i, the central shaft. So what Hiskuni is saying here, and the editor of this translation on top of that, is that there is some reason to think that perhaps this commentary in Rashi, when it's talking about the seven lamps, is a little bit mistaken, because it's got a word missing, talking about that central staff. Now, our translation of Rashi doesn't seem to have that problem, which implies that this editor has chosen a manuscript which doesn't have that issue. But this is a nice reminder, if you want to call it that. But if you are interested in serious study, then you should be prepared for this, that some of the texts from the Middle Ages, whether it be Rashi or other commentators, sometimes there are mistakes in how they were transmitted. Yes, things like the Mishnah and Midrash were generally more carefully copied. The Talmud certainly as well, although there was also some heavy censorship in Europe by the Catholic Church, and obviously the Torah was copied as perfectly as humanly possible, generation to generation. But other people's books, like Rashi or even Hiskuni himself or Rambam or others, there was always the problem, the potential, that in the rush to make additional copies, which were all had to be done by hand, that words might have been skipped or even added. As such, we are indebted to the various manuscripts or the quotations of different texts that are found in other texts to try and put together a correct version of what was likely the original text for each of our authors. That's not an easy job. It's something that people will spend many years on research and investigation. Sometimes we will be blessed by things like the Cairo Geniza, which will be a treasure trove of important artifacts that will give us more insight into some of the changes that can happen in some of these other texts. It's also a good reminder that, as important as Rashi is, he wasn't considered the most important person immediately. Everybody recognized the genius of his commentary for both Talmud and Tanakh, but that doesn't mean that he was considered at the near saintly level that he can be in the modern world. And so the careful copying of his text would not have been given the superlative status that it would in our present day. And so indeed, mistakes could easily crop in between manuscripts, which is why it's good to compare different ones and to note where these things might happen. Okay, back to our Rashi text for verse 3, where we are talking about Aaron fulfilling the command as he was instructed. Aaron did so. This is stated in order to tell the praise of Aaron, that he did not deviate, meaning from God's command. So this happens a few times throughout the Torah, where we will get God tells Moses, Moses tells Aaron, and then Aaron actually does it. And what Rashi is trying to remind us here from the Midrash is that this is given not as a redundancy, but to give us, the proper feeling of way to go, Aaron. That Aaron is in fact fulfilling the commands as they were given, which is an important step in confirming that the Torah as being revealed is being implemented as it is being revealed, meaning in the way that it according to the content that is being revealed. And now we'll finish up with our menorah conversation here with verse 4, where we talked about the special creation of the menorah in this hammered work of gold. And this is the work of the menorah. This we may gather that the Holy One, blessed be he, showed it to him, meaning Moses, with his finger, because he, meaning Moses, was puzzled by it, meaning how to construct it. And that is why that states, this is the construction of the candlestick. So set aside the anthropomorphism of the finger that's being used here as a metaphor, that if we are going to, let's back it up a little bit. This is a common sticking point for many people when they are becoming more interested in detailed study of Torah, which is, how do we know that the Torah and what we do, and in this case, what we did, are actually the same? Maybe we got it wrong. I mean, after all, if I were to sit down and had artistic talent and try to draw the menorah based upon the descriptions from the book of Exodus, and you were to do the same, and then we were to compare our pictures, they're not going to look the same. That, 7 branches with the little botanical references mentioned, really, the Torah is, this is going to sound wrong, but hold on, the Torah is an inadequate description needed for the actual carrying out of the task. That the physical construction of the menorah, the actual, how is it supposed to look, is not something that can just be imagined. Well, rather, it can be imagined, but it cannot be reliably imagined by everyone based upon the description. In order to recreate the actual image of the menorah that God intended, the Torah would have had to have gone into much greater detail for what it would actually look like. But what do we know now from this passage here in verse 4? Well, this. Well, as a sort of demonstrative type of word, what is the this pointing at? The fingering towards, what is it indicating? Well, it's indicating that God had to show Moses, had to provide a vision of what the menorah would look like, so Moses would know whether the menorah they were making was actually being made correctly. This is a very strong indication of what is understood by Rabbinic Judaism in general to be the so-called oral Torah. Now, the oral Torah doesn't just mean that there was a verbal component to the Torah. It means that there is content necessary for the fulfillment of the Torah that had to be given in addition to the written text that we have. That there would be no reliable way to create a menorah according to the instructions of God purely from the written text of the Torah itself. There had to be additional explanation, or in this case, diagram, vision, provided in order to make sure that the menorah that we have is the menorah that God wants. And that's true of a number of aspects of Torah observance, that the Torah is simply incomplete without additional explanatory notes, diagrams, explanations, whatever you want to call it. Now, that's not a problem under Rabbinic Judaism, which as a conservative Jew, I am a part of, because we recognize that in any learning situation where you are transmitting instructions from one person to another, there can be a written component, but that unless that written component is either incredibly self-evident or very, very detailed, there is going to need to be additional verbal explanation, clarification, and elaboration. And that is a perfectly normal teaching methodology. If any of you who have ever gone to a proper teacher at any time in your life, whether it be elementary, high school, university, or private instruction beyond, you know that a good teacher will give you a text. They will have you discuss it. They'll have you read it. And then they will continue to discuss it and explain it and elucidate on and expand upon it in ways that the text itself do not say by themselves. But once it's explained, it's clear that it is implied. It is understood within that text itself. For some people, this is a very difficult concept to wrap their head around. It makes them feel like like Rabbinic Judaism is saying that the Torah is incomplete or that the Torah is inadequate in the way that it was given. That is not what it means at all. I know that there are people out there, especially in other faith traditions, that have trouble with this idea, but in Judaism, for more than 2,000 years, we have record of our sages understanding that any text is not self-explanatory. It needs context, it needs teaching, it needs the explanation of somebody who has received that proper explanation to ensure that you know it. There's a very famous example in the Talmud Midrash where somebody comes to the rabbi and wants to learn to become Jewish, but doesn't want to learn the oral Torah, doesn't want to learn the Torah Sheba'al Peh, just wants the written Torah. So the rabbi, humoring them, says, fine, we'll start off by learning the Aleph Bet. This is an Aleph, this is a Bet, this is a Gimel, and so on all the way through Tav. The next day, the man comes back and the rabbi says, okay, let's review the Aleph Bet. And he points to the letter Aleph and he says, this is a Tav. He points to the letter Bet and he says, this is a Shin. And the man says, wait a minute, Yesterday, you said that was called Aleph. How come today you're calling it Tav? To which the rabbi responds, if you have to trust me to explain to you what a simple letter is, then you're going to have to trust me to explain what the oral Torah is and why it is needed as well. It's impossible to simply know it in some objective, self-contained way. There has to be a structure, a shared understanding, a culture of interpretation that has been passed from one generation to the next in order for us to actually understand. And we can see this again in comparison to the ancient texts or ritual items found from cultures that no longer exist and which have no continuity of transmission. If you dig up something from a culture from 10,000 years ago, and it has various depictions of rituals on it, we can make guesses about what they might have intended, what they might have done, about why they were doing these things, but we have no way of actually knowing. Even if we have written text, that doesn't mean that we are close to understanding truly the content of what they were doing, let alone the meaning of what they were doing. It's only when you have a continual additional narrative that is being perpetuated, carried on by person to person to person, that actually becomes feasible. That you need to have continuity, or else it's going to become meaningless, even if you have the written word in front of you. So that's what Rashi is trying to tell us with this zeh, tiny word, major important concept. So let's carry on, and continuing on with our hammering for the creation, and we'll leave aside the translation question here. There was a block weighing a talent of gold. That's a lot of gold. And he, meaning the manufacturer who made the candlestick, beat it with the hammer and cut away with a chisel in order that its branches might be made to spread out as they should do. And it was not formed of separate items made into whole by joining them together. All right, so the usual way of making a menorah, a candelabrum of any kind, or indeed any sort of complicated piece, three-dimensional object, would be to take a piece of gold, beat it into the right shape, and then solder it, weld it to the other pieces, and then continue to add the different elements as you went around. It is much harder. It is much more elaborate to take one piece and from it extract all of the different three-dimensional elements. And yet that is what the words of the Torah seem to be saying, that it was hammered out completely rather than made from different pieces being stuck together. And then he goes on to the construction points. Sorry, we just need to get down to trying to remember. Yes, there were things that we didn't need to go into that were pretty much just construction details. Let's pick up here. According to the pattern which the Lord had shown him on the mountain, that is to say, according to the shape which he had shown him in the mountain, as it is said in Exodus 25:40, and see that you make them after their pattern, which was shown on the mountain. Again, reminding us that there had to be an additional visualization necessary in order to make sure that it would be correct, that it's not just a written law. Now, here at the last line here in our verse 4, we get this phrase. So he made the candelabrum, and now we're bumping up against an issue of pronoun confusion. Hebrew in particular is prone to this because not only is the pronoun for he and she also used for non-living things, but we also have pronouns meaning in place of where we might use the word it in English, but we also have many implied pronouns or many implied subjects of the predicate because Hebrew has such a strong conjugation pattern. So, for example, when we have the word asa, that is implying the masculine singular tense or masculine singular subject. So who is that subject? Well, we're not sure because there's no named subject next to the verb. So we have to try and unpack that. And how do we do that? Well, he means the one who made it. not Moses, as might be assumed from the wording of the text. The subject is suppressed, and it means no more than so was the candlestick made. So Rashi is essentially arguing, at least the interpretation here of Rashi is arguing, that this is akin to almost the passive voice, that this particular phrase is introducing a pronoun in the he made that is entirely implied and outside the sentence that we're currently dealing with, which is, grammatically unusual. Usually, if we have a pronoun, we like that pronoun to be referring to a noun that was recently discussed, preferably the most recent noun, called the antecedent noun, but at least a clear noun, a noun that makes sense within the conversation. But here, this he made it can't be talking about Moses, because we know from Exodus that Moses himself didn't make it. So it must be talking about the actual construction workers. And that means that it's a better rendered almost as the passive voice. It was made. Midrashic explanation, on the other hand, which Rashi brings for us, by the instrumentality of the Holy One, blessed be he, it was made of itself, meaning according to this, the subject is God, who mentioned it immediately before. So the idea being that as we had this, and God showed to Moses, and thus he made it, the God is the subject of that showed, that God was the one making the demonstration, and therefore grammatically it's perfectly reasonable to say God is also the subject of the he made. And even though God isn't actually gendered, we do tend to use the masculine singular when doing grammar for God. So the idea here would be that God is the one that made the menorah, but not in a magic wand, make it appear kind of make, but that God was responsible for the making of it. After all, God is the one who designed it. And this is another powerful idea, that we talk about the Torah as being divinely made, but that doesn't mean that the Torah was actually physically constructed in some miraculous manner by God's own direct agency, the same way that the universe was. Instead, it means that the Torah was authored by God, even if the hand that wrote it was a human hand. And likewise, the menorah was made by God, even though God himself never picked up a hammer or caused the gold to be shaped in some other way, other than purely by giving instruction and guidance to those that worked. Okay, let me double check our time. Okay, you know what? We're gonna pop in because I want to make sure that we talk a little bit about the theme that comes in the second half of this chapter, and otherwise we're going to run out of time. So let me get ourselves loaded up on both sides, and let's make a break for it. So beginning with with verse 5. Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, "Take the Levites from among the Israelites and purify them. This is what you shall do to them to purify them. Sprinkle on them water of purification, and let them go over their whole body with a razor and wash their clothes. Thus they shall be purified. Let them take a bull of the herd, and with it a meal offering of choice flour with mixed oil in, and you take a second bull of the herd for a sin offering. You shall bring the Levites forward from the tent of meeting, assemble the Israelite community leadership, and bring the Levites before Adonai. Let the Israelites lay their hands upon the Levites, and let Aaron designate the Levites before Adonai as an elevation offering from the Israelites, that they may perform the service of Adonai. The Levites shall now lay their hands upon the heads of the bulls. One shall be offered to Adonai as a sin offering, and the other as a burnt offering to make expiation for the Levites. You shall place the Levites in attendance upon Aaron and his sons, and designate them as an elevation offering to Adonai. Thus you shall set the Levites apart from the Israelites, and the Levites shall be mine. Thereafter, the Levites shall be qualified for the service of the tent of meeting, once you have purified and designated them as an elevation offering. For they are formally assigned to me. From among the Israelites, I have taken them for myself in place of all the first issue of the womb, of all of the male firstborn of the Israelites. For every male firstborn among the Israelites, human as well as beast, is mine. I consecrated them to myself at the time that I smote every male firstborn in the land of Egypt. Now I take the Levites instead of every male firstborn of the Israelites. And from among the Israelites, I formally assign the Levites to Aaron and his sons to perform the service for the Israelites in the tent of meeting and to make expiation for the Israelites, so that no plague may afflict the Israelites for coming too near the sanctuary. Moses, Aaron, and the Israelite community leadership did with the Levites accordingly, just as Adonai had commanded Moses in regard to the Levites, so the Israelites did with them. The Levites purified themselves, washed their clothes, and Aaron designated them as an elevation offering before Adonai, and Aaron made expiation for them. All right, we're not going to go any further. One more line. Thereafter, the Levites were qualified to perform their service in the tent of meeting under Aaron and his sons, as Adonai had commanded Moses in regard to the Levites, so they did to them. Okay, so I know that was a very quick run through, and we're going to look at a few of the comments on this topic, but the basic idea here is that the Levites, in addition to the Kohanim, need a special designation. And as we can see, their designation is going to involve certain ritual practices, which are very similar to how the Kohanim were prepared, but also a concept of them as being in lieu of the firstborn of the Israelites themselves. That the firstborn of everything in the community was designated for God, but that the firstborn of the Israelites, rather than going to serve directly, were going to be replaced by the members of the Levite clan. So let's go ahead and take a look at our commentary and see what we are to make of this. And whoops, let's get that back down to there. Oh, come on. And sorry, I just need to, I should have written down exactly which ones, because I didn't realize we'd be running this low on time. So it talks about the sanctification, the using the mechatat, the water that was created from the see, so what happens when you get too many words jamming into your brain at the same time? The water that was created from the red heifer that was used to create a purification before officiating or participating in a sacrificial service. More on that, of course, in Parashat Chukat. But the part I want to doubly make sure we get in here was this, come down here to 8:9, where we say that they'll gather the whole assembly of Israel together to talk about this, this crossover, this taking of responsibility and moving it to the Levites. Let me just get both Chizkuni and Rashi together. There we are. Now, we shall gather the whole assembly together. Why? Because the Levites were made, so to speak, an expiation offering in their stead. Let them come and stand at their offering and put their hands upon them, meaning the Levites, as prescribed in the case of an offering. So Rashi is pointing out that if we go back to the book of Leviticus and we see the description of behavior where the person who is making an offering would put their hands upon the animal that is going to be sacrificed, that this is running very parallel, that the people, the rank and file Israelites, like me and, well, all of you that aren't a Kohen or Levi, would put their hands upon the Levites the same way they would if they were about to make an offering. Now, the Levites are not going to be slaughtered, don't worry. No Levites were harmed in the making of this show. Instead, the Levites are going to be receiving that appointment, that agency. They are having it transferred to them from the community as a whole, which is something that I've talked a number of times in past classes about, that prior to this appointment of the Kohanim and the Levites as a secondary layer, the firstborn of each clan were the ones responsible for this sort of activity. They were the ones who did the sacrifices generally. But here we are handing over that idea. And Rashi is focusing on that as being a similar action as we would for a sacrifice. Because Kuni, on the other hand, introduces an additional idea. We find this kind of procedure, the laying upon hands, the literally smichut, the same term that's used for the creation of a new rabbi, also in Numbers 27, where God tells Moses to appoint Joshua as his successor. you are to place your hand upon him. Whenever this procedure is mentioned in the Bible, it means that authority is being transferred by the person placing his hand or hands on the person to be appointed. The first person to do so was Yaakov in Genesis 48, where he placed his right hand on Joseph's younger son Ephraim, indicating that he should be treated as his firstborn. So rather than seeing this purely as being a parallel to the sacrificial service, Chizkuni sees this as being parallel to the appointment, the authorization. Now, these are not mutually contradictory. It's just which would a person choose to emphasize. Do we want to emphasize the notion of the Levites as being offered up as almost a sacrifice by the people? And sorry, the internet's going weird for me. Yes, no, hello. Come on, you were doing so well today. Hopefully it'll catch up. Or are we going to emphasize this as them being appointed? Now, why would we think of them as being an expiation, right? Why is that an option? Well, if this is still working, and if I can find my quote now, then we look down here at 8:17. Excuse me, where he reminds us that all the firstborn were belonging to God from the time that we left Egypt. This means they became mine by strict right. Literally, that we're talking here about the right of justice. That is how tight the bond to this this notion of us being the firstborn being bound to God. Because I protected them, distinguishing between them and the firstborn of Egypt, and I took them as mine. I mean, look, we know what happens to other firstborns that were not on God's side. They got wiped out in Egypt. Therefore, this firstborn owes God. They are in God's debt above and beyond the debt of the rest of the nation. Until they sinned by worshiping the golden calf. So now I have taken the Levites in their stead, which comes in verse 18. So this notion that the Levites are a replacement is also as an expiation, as a way of a sin offering, is because of the sin of the golden calf, that the firstborn, they messed up, that the firstborn participated in the sin of the golden calf, and therefore they lost their right to officiate, even though they had, by definition, been elevated to a special responsibility to God because of their protection during the 10th plague. They kind of lost that right to be the one to do these things. And as such, God is transferring it to the Levites. And as such, the Levites are going to act almost as a sacrifice in their place to make up for that sin of the golden calf. So it's a powerful message. And I just want to finish off, and hopefully this is still recording properly, although Zoom is still giving me some strange error messages, with the last comment here from Chizkuni on verse 18. I have taken the Levites instead of the firstborn. If all the firstborn were to perform service in the temple, this would lead to the people suffering a plague, as there is no guarantee that the father of the firstborn performing that service had also been a firstborn, neither his grandfather, right? So if the second child of a family has his firstborn would then have the right to serve in the temple, even though his father, who was number two to his father, didn't. And what he's saying is that there would be no continuity of knowledge. As a result, that family had not had an opportunity to become thoroughly familiar with all the intricacies of temple service. Failure to perform the service properly would result in God's killing such a person, as we know from what happened to the two older sons of Aaron, Nadav and Avihu. So if you don't have people who are growing up knowing how all of these duties work, then you're going to end up with the opportunity for terrible mistakes. And firstbornness is not a hereditary status. Yes, there will be some firstborn, but from your second, third, or fourth kid, well, they're not firstborn, so they would not have had that experience, but they will very likely have a firstborn of their own that would then go off to officiate and probably make lots of blunders. Once the Levites had been appointed and the status had become a hereditary one, each member of each family made a point of being thoroughly familiar with all their duties. This is why the Torah writes, the Levite is not to own ancestral land in the land of Israel. By not owning land and growing crops, they were free to concentrate on their tasks as Levites. They should not acquire too much familiarity with the tools used by farmers and artisans so that they would not be diverted from the principal vocation, service in the temple. If the Levite were to devote himself to those mundane activities, his fingers would become too coarse to play the musical instruments sufficiently to accompany the choir of Levites during the time when the temple service was in progress. So Chizkuni finishes off with a very practical idea. It's not just about knowledge, it's also even beyond that about physical preparation, that in order to perform all the duties, including such as playing the instruments, means that you need to keep your hands free from the calluses that would come from the work necessary for most of human history to eke out a living from the land. And as such, the Levites were not spared from that work in order to be pampered, but were spared from that work in order that their bodies would still be fit to perform the other duties that were their duties alone. All right, so since Zoom is being really weird, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up there. Let me just check if anyone has any questions. And not hearing any, we will go ahead and wrap it up there. Sorry for a little bit of the technology problems here, but hopefully that all came through. I'll double check YouTube and make sure that it finished, I hope. If not,